Imagine you wake up tomorrow, check your phone, and oil has jumped so hard that traders, presidents, shipping insurers, and your local gas station owner are all having the same bad morning. Not because a giant country vanished, not because the world ran out of oil, but because one narrow waterway, small enough to look almost petty on a map, started choking the global system. The Strait of Hormuz carries more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade, roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption, and about 1/5 of global LNG trade. That is an absurd amount of planetary stress flowing through one maritime bottleneck. Now picture yourself as a factory owner in India, a commuter in London, a fertilizer importer in Africa, a policymaker in Tokyo, or just a normal person standing under fluorescent supermarket lights, wondering why everything suddenly feels more expensive. Because when Hormuz shakes, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It leaks into fuel prices, electricity, costs, shipping insurance, food inputs, inflation expectations, and military strategy. In March 2026, the stakes got even more obvious. The US Energy Information Administration warned that an extended closure of the strait is the main upside risk to oil prices, while official forecasts linked Hormuz disruptions to higher coal prices and broader energy stress. So in this video, we are going to break down what the Strait of Hormuz is, why it matters so much, who depends on it, what happens if traffic is disrupted, what the strongest counter-arguments are, and why this tiny strip of water keeps the global economy in a kind of permanent low-grade panic attack. Because yes, modern civilization did put a shocking amount of its energy security into a narrow passage beside Iran and Oman, which in hindsight feels like the geopolitical version of balancing your life savings on a plastic garden chair. Let's get into it. 1. The Strait itself, the world's most expensive narrow hallway. Imagine you're standing on a shoreline in the Gulf at sunrise. The water looks calm, the horizon looks innocent. Seabirds are doing seabird things. Somewhere a tanker captain is checking navigation data, an insurer is checking risk models, and a finance minister is checking whether today will be the kind of day that ruins a budget. Because what you are looking at is not just water. You're looking at one of the most important choke points in the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage between Iran to the north and Oman to the south that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then the Arabian Sea. The US Energy Information Administration describes it as one of the world's most important oil choke points, and that is not think tank melodrama. That is the boring official wording for, if this goes badly, everybody's day gets worse. Now here is where geography starts acting like a supervillain. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is about 21 miles wide, or roughly 29 nautical miles / 54 kilometers, depending on which measurement convention you use. That sounds manageable until you realize the part ships actually use is far tighter. There are 2 navigable shipping lanes about 2 miles wide each, one inbound and one outbound, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. In plain English, this means one of the most important energy arteries on Earth works less like a vast ocean and more like a heavily armed maritime toll booth with anger issues, and yet, despite being narrow, the water is deep enough and wide enough to handle the world's largest crude tankers. That matters because this is not a route for casual weekend boating and somebody's inflatable flamingo. These are enormous vessels hauling the energy equivalent of national mood swings. EIA notes that the strait can handle the world's largest crude oil tankers and the international energy. Agency says the same basic thing in different bureaucratic clothing. So the Strait of Hormuz is not important because it is tiny. It is important because it is narrow enough to be vulnerable, but large enough to matter at planetary scale. This is the first big thing people miss. The real risk is not just can someone literally close it. The stronger question is, can someone make traffic through it dangerous, uncertain, expensive, or politically toxic enough that shipping slows, insurers panic and prices jump anyway? Because global markets do not wait for a perfect Hollywood-style closure scene with dramatic explosions and a man in a war room whispering, "It has begun." Markets price fear before reality fully arrives. That is why even recent tensions, without a clean long-term total closure, have been enough to move oil prices. In June 2025, EIA noted that after regional tensions rose, Brent crude jumped from $69 per barrel on June 12th to $74 on June 13th. That is the economic equivalent of the market hearing a floorboard creak upstairs and immediately grabbing a knife. Here is another detail that makes Hormuz such a headache. The legal and operational picture is more complicated than the average who controls it? Argument on social media. The shipping lanes are located primarily in Omani territorial waters, with part of the area touching Iranian waters, but the route is governed by the international legal framework for straits used for international navigation. In other words, this is not supposed to be one country's private driveway. That said, law on paper and safety in practice are two different species. A legal right of transit does not make missiles, mines, drones, or harassment magically disappear. That gap between legal principle and physical vulnerability is one reason Hormuz keeps frightening energy markets. The law says ships may pass. Geography asks, sure, but how brave are they feeling today? And this is where the argument for people exaggerate Hormuz risk deserves a fair hearing. The strongest version goes like this. The strait is deep, relatively wide by military standards, shipping lanes are established, international naval power exists, and Iran, or any actor trying to fully seal the route for long, would face huge operational, legal and strategic costs. Britannica even notes that the depth and width make it difficult for any country to disrupt shipping for a prolonged period of time. That is a real argument, and it is not crazy. If the claim is Hormuz can be permanently sealed with ease, that claim is weak. But here is the dismantling part. You do not need a permanent airtight blockade to cause global damage. You just need enough uncertainty to reduce flows, delay cargoes, raise war risk premiums, complicate insurance, reroute ships, or force energy buyers into bidding wars. EIA's own analysis makes clear that the choke point matters precisely because very few alternative options exist to move the same volumes out of the Gulf, even though there are some bypass pipelines. This is the key mechanical point. The world does not need a total stop to feel pain. A partial interruption in a market this large can be enough. Think of it like a major artery in a city. You do not need to demolish the whole highway to produce a traffic nightmare. One bad crash in the wrong lane at the wrong hour is enough to ruin everybody's commute. Hormuz is that, except the commuters are governments, utilities, refiners, airlines, factories, and your grocery bill. And the numbers explain why. In 2024, oil flow through the strait averaged about 20 million barrels per day, equivalent to around 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. The EIA also estimates that flows through Hormuz accounted for more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade. On top of that, around 1/5 of global LNG trade transited the strait in 2024, mostly from Qatar. So this is not just an oil nerds and ties story. LNG matters for electricity generation, industrial heat, chemicals and fertilizer production. When gas logistics tighten, the effects can show up in power prices and food economics, with a delay that makes everything feel weirdly disconnected, until it suddenly does not. Now let me make this vivid. You are not a tanker captain. You are just a consumer in a country far away, maybe nowhere near the Gulf. You hear Strait of Hormuz and think, that sounds like a place my high school geography teacher tried to make me care about and failed. Fair enough. But if the route gets stressed, Asian importers may scramble harder for cargoes, insurers may charge more, shipping patterns may change, traders may price in risk, and energy importing economies may face new inflation pressure. Suddenly your central bank gets more nervous, your airline ticket gets meaner, your grocery store becomes a silent documentary about supply chains and human suffering. That is how geography turns into macroeconomics. Also, little fun fact. One reason this tiny corridor has such a large psychological effect is because it is easy to visualize. A narrow waterway through which huge amounts of energy pass is the kind of sentence that makes markets instantly understand the problem. It is the geopolitical version of hearing that your apartment building has just one elevator and it's making a new noise. Nobody needs a PhD to know that is bad. And before we move on, this is probably a good place for a quick channel reminder. If you like videos that take complicated global systems and explain them without sounding like a textbook held hostage by PowerPoint, hit subscribe, like the video, and let me know in the comments what other choke points, energy crises, or financial pressure points you want covered next. Because the world economy is full of places that look boring on a map and then suddenly become everyone's problem. The biggest takeaway from this first section is simple. Hormuz matters because of mechanics, not mythology. It is not magic. It is not a buzzword. It is a narrow, legally contested, heavily watched, physically vulnerable corridor through which astonishing volumes of oil and gas still move. That is why it keeps showing up in headlines, military planning, central bank worries, and late-night trader stress. It is a strip of water with the personality of a loaded spring. And now that you know what the place actually is, the next question becomes even more important. Why did the world end up depending on this one corridor so much in the first place? 2. Why the world still depends on it so much. Now that you can picture the Strait of Hormuz as the world's most anxiety-inducing hallway, the next question is obvious. Why is so much of the global economy still walking through it? Why, after oil shocks, wars, tanker attacks, sanctions, and decades of policymakers making serious faces on television, does this one route still matter so much? Because geography, infrastructure, and energy economics are stubborn. And unlike politicians, pipelines cannot be built from vibes. Start with the producer side. The Strait of Hormuz is the primary export route for oil produced by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Bahrain, and Iran. That is not some fringe list. That is a huge share of the Gulf's hydrocarbon system. The International Energy Agency notes that a prolonged disruption at Hormuz would not only hit current shipments, it could also make unavailable most of the world's spare oil production capacity, because so much of that spare capacity sits in Saudi Arabia and still relies on export infrastructure tied to the Gulf system. In simple terms, even the backup supply has a backup problem, IEA. Then there is the buyer side. The bulk of oil leaving the strait heads to Asia, especially China, India, Japan, and South Korea. The US Energy Information Administration estimates that 89% of the crude oil and condensate moving through Hormuz in the first half of 2025 went to Asian markets. The IEA says almost 90% of LNG exported via the strait in 2025 also went to Asia, with just over 10% going to Europe. That means Hormuz is not just a Middle East issue, it is deeply embedded in the energy security of Asia's industrial giants, and by extension in global manufacturing, shipping demand, petrochemicals, electricity costs, and inflation. So picture this in second-person terms. You are a policymaker in India or Japan. You are not looking at Hormuz as a map trivia question. You are looking at it as a live wire attached to your economy. If flows through the strait become uncertain, your refiners may scramble for cargoes, your utilities may worry about LNG, your currency may take pressure from higher import costs, and your central bank suddenly has to think about energy-driven inflation again. The strait is far away geographically, but financially it can turn up in your country's numbers like an uninvited relative who somehow has keys. And this is where people often make a lazy assumption. Well, can't exporters just go around it? That is the strongest comforting argument, and to be fair, there is some truth to it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have infrastructure that can bypass the strait. According to the EIA's March 2026 chokepoints analysis, Saudi Aramco's east-west crude oil pipeline and the UAE's Abu Dhabi pipeline together could provide about 4.7 million barrels per day of bypass capacity in the event of a disruption. The UAE also plans another 1.5 million barrels per day pipeline from Jebel Dana to Fujairah by 2027, specifically to circumvent the strait. That sounds reassuring until you compare it with the actual scale of Hormuz traffic. In 2024, about 20 million barrels per day of petroleum liquids moved through the strait. So even if those bypass systems are fully available and functioning, they still replace only a fraction of normal flows. This is the mechanics over hype point. The issue is not whether alternatives exist at all. The issue is whether they exist at the same scale. Right now, they do not. You can build a side door, but if a stadium's worth of people still need the main gate, the side door is not a solution. It is a coping mechanism. Iran also has a bypass story, at least on paper. EIA notes that Iran's Gorajask pipeline was designed to move crude to the Gulf of Oman without using Hormuz, but although the line has a nameplate capacity of 1.0 million barrels per day, EIA reports it could transport only about 300,000 barrels per day as of mid-2024, and activity has been limited. Again, this is classic infrastructure reality. A project can exist, get headlines, and still not come close to changing the actual global equation. A ribbon-cutting ceremony is not the same thing as strategic redundancy. There is also a bigger macro point here. Hormuz matters because it concentrates not just energy volumes but market psychology. The Gulf is home to many of the world's lowest-cost producers, even when countries are trying to diversify energy sources, reduce oil intensity or grow renewables. Global oil markets still clear on marginal barrels and spare capacity, and a lot of that spare capacity is connected to this region. So when traders worry about Hormuz, they're not only worrying about current shipments, they're worrying about the system's ability to respond to a shock elsewhere. It is like learning that your hospital is busy during normal hours and then finding out the backup generator is also in a questionable mood. This is why the world is transitioning away from oil anyway argument needs nuance. Yes, the energy mix is changing over time. Yes, renewables are gaining share in electricity. Yes, EV adoption is growing in many markets. But as of 2026, oil and gas remain central to transport, petrochemicals, industrial systems, and much of global trade. LNG from the Gulf still matters for power and industry, especially in Asia. The IEA's own March 2026 commentary still frames Hormuz as critical to seaborne oil trade and global energy security. The transition is real. The dependency is also still real. Both statements can be true at the same time, which is frustrating if you were hoping for a cleaner movie script with one villain and one hero. And here is where the irony gets especially sharp. The world has known for decades that Hormuz is a choke point. Governments, militaries, oil companies, traders, and international agencies have all discussed this endlessly. Yet the system still depends on it because the alternatives are expensive, slow, politically complicated, and often underbuilt relative to the scale required. This is one of those areas where everyone knows the risk, and the risk is solved living completely different universes. Human civilization is amazing at identifying structural vulnerabilities and then continuing to run through them at full speed, because fixing them costs money. UNCTAD put it more diplomatically in its recent work on Hormuz disruptions, warning that disruptions underscore how vulnerable critical maritime choke points are to geopolitical tensions, and how easily those shocks can spread across supply chains and commodity markets. That is, trade policy language for your problem will not stay your problem for long. So the big answer to why the world still depends on Hormuz is not mystery. It is a stack of hard realities. The producers are there, the export systems are there, the buyers are there, the alternatives are partial, the spare capacity is concentrated, and the global economy still runs on more hydrocarbons than many people like to admit out loud, which means the strait is not important because the world is foolish enough to think it is invincible. It is important because even after decades of knowing better, the world still cannot replace what it does at full scale. And once you understand that dependency, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly happens to prices, shipping, insurance, and ordinary economies when Hormuz gets disrupted? 3. What happens when Hormuz gets disrupted? Prices, panic, and the very modern art of making everything more expensive. Let's say you're running a refinery, a shipping company, an airline, a fertilizer importer, or a central bank. In other words, let's say you are having a bad enough time already. Then headlines start flashing that traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is being disrupted. What happens next? Not one thing, a chain reaction. And that chain reaction is the most important part to understand, because people often imagine energy shocks as something very simple. Oil stops, prices go up. That is true, but it is like saying, your house caught fire, so the temperature changed. Technically correct. Emotionally underwhelming. The real story is in the mechanics. The first thing that moves is usually expectations. Markets do not wait politely for a full physical shortage to be confirmed by a committee in a beige room. Traders, insurers, refiners, and governments start pricing in the probability of lost supply, delayed shipments, military escalation, and higher transport costs. That is why even the fear of disruption can matter. The US Energy Information Administration has repeatedly flagged Hormuz as the main upside risk to oil prices because such a large share of seaborne oil and LNG moves through it. In June 2025, after regional tensions escalated, Brent crude rose from $69 per barrel on June 12th to $74 per barrel on June 13th, before later easing as markets reassessed the risk. That move happened before a long-term full shutdown, which tells you something important. The market does not need certainty to panic. It only needs plausible danger. Then comes shipping risk. If vessels are threatened, harassed, mined, delayed, or face a higher probability of attack, the economics of moving cargo through the area change immediately. Shipping companies may hesitate, some charterers may wait, some cargoes may be delayed, crews and operators may demand additional compensation. Most importantly, insurance costs rise, especially war risk premiums. UNCTAD's recent analysis on Hormuz disruptions warned that interruptions in the strait can rapidly raise transport costs, tighten shipping availability, and spill over into commodity markets and wider supply chains. In plain language, if the waterway starts looking dangerous, every ship that still goes through it suddenly becomes more expensive before the oil even reaches a refinery. And once transport costs rise, the problem stops being just an oil problem. It becomes an energy logistics problem. You are a buyer in Asia. You need crude. So do other buyers. Cargoes that still move become more valuable. Alternative supply routes become more attractive. Freight rates can jump. Insurance spikes. Delivery windows become uncertain. Refiners start recalculating margins. Governments start thinking about reserves. Traders start thinking about arbitrage. Analysts start saying the phrase upside risk a lot because it sounds more respectable than everybody is sweating. Now zoom out one level further. The EIA says roughly 20 million barrels per day moved through Hormuz in 2024, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, and that the strait also handled about 1/5 of global LNG trade. That means a disruption can affect not just gasoline and diesel, but also electricity generation, industrial gas use, chemicals, and fertilizer economics, especially where LNG and Gulf petrochemical feedstocks matter. The Guardian's reporting on the current March 2026 conflict highlighted this broader vulnerability in Africa, where disruptions to Gulf-linked flows are also pushing on fertilizer inputs and food costs. Even if you never buy a barrel of oil yourself, which, congratulations, neither do I unless I am having a very confusing week, you still feel the downstream effects through transport, power, and food systems. This is where the steelman argument for calm deserves to be taken seriously. The strongest version says, yes, prices spike, but the world has buffers. Strategic reserves exist. Some bypass pipelines exist. Producers outside the Gulf can respond over time. Demand can soften if prices rise. Not every shipping disruption becomes a global catastrophe, and that is correct. Even now, some analysts argue the main shock is concentrated in energy, rather than becoming a full repeat of the 2021 to 2022 supply chain mess. Goldman Sachs, for example, argued this week that the current crisis looks more like an oil shock than a broad trade system breakdown, and estimated a hit to global GDP and higher inflation without assuming every corner of world commerce falls apart. That is an important point. We should not exaggerate. Hormuz disruption does not automatically mean civilization forgets how to function by Tuesday. But here is what that calmer view often understates. Energy is special and narrow. Disruption in the wrong energy corridor can still do outsized damage because energy sits upstream of so many other costs. Fuel affects trucking. Trucking affects retail prices. Jet fuel affects airfare and freight. Natural gas affects power and fertilizer. Fertilizer affects food prices. Food prices affect politics. Politics affects fiscal spending. Fiscal stress affects currencies and debt markets. This is how one maritime problem becomes a macroeconomic mood disorder, and in current conditions the effects are not theoretical. Reuters reported on March 16, 2026, that Middle East Gulf oil exports had fallen by at least 60% in the prior week, as Hormuz remained mostly closed, with Kpler estimating exports from key producers dropped to 9.71 million barrels per day from 25.13 million barrels per day in February, while Vortexa estimated flows as low as 7.5 million barrels per day. Reuters also reported that the IEA said it may release more oil from emergency stocks if needed, underscoring that strategic reserves are being treated as a stabilizer rather than a decoration governments keep around for emotional support. That last point matters. Strategic reserves do not solve Hormuz. They buy time. They can smooth an acute shortage, calm panic, and limit the initial blow to prices. But they do not reopen the waterway. They do not magically restore shipping confidence. they do not permanently replace millions of barrels a day from low-cost Gulf producers. They are like a fire extinguisher in a kitchen, incredibly valuable in the right moment, but not the same thing as rebuilding the wall after the fire. There is also a financial market layer that gets less attention but matters a lot. If energy prices jump sharply, import-dependent countries may face pressure on their trade balances, currencies, and inflation expectations. Central banks then face a familiar nightmare. Growth may be weakening while inflation risks are rising. That is the policy version of being told to drive faster and brake harder at the same time. For lower-income importing countries, the pain can be even worse because they often have less fiscal room to subsidize fuel, weaker currencies, and higher sensitivity to global commodity prices. UNCTAD has emphasized that developing economies are especially exposed to disruptions in critical maritime choke points because higher freight and commodity costs hit budgets, food systems, and external accounts all at once. To make this even more human, imagine you are just a regular person nowhere near the Gulf. You see a headline about Hormuz and think, that sounds serious, but I have rent due. Fair. Then 2 weeks later, your fuel costs are up, airline tickets are worse, imported goods are pricier, and the same politicians who said inflation was under control are back on television explaining that global conditions are complicated. Which is true. But it's also the sort of sentence governments use when geography has once again elbow-dropped the economy from the top rope. And that is the real lesson of Hormuz disruptions. They do not stay in the Gulf. They travel through prices, contracts, shipping lanes, insurance policies, reserve drawdowns, fiscal plans, and ordinary household budgets. A narrow waterway becomes a global tax on uncertainty. So by now you can see the pattern. Geography creates the vulnerability. Dependency magnifies it. Disruption transmits it through markets. But that still leaves one huge question. Who actually has the power to threaten, protect, or influence what happens in Hormuz? Because this strait is not just an economic choke point. It is a stage full of states, navies, militias, tankers, insurers, and very nervous diplomats. Who can threaten it? Who can protect it? And why? Control is a tricky word. When people talk about the Strait of Hormuz, they often say things like, who controls it? As if this is a simple video game map and one faction just needs to capture the flag. It is not that neat. The better question is, who can influence traffic through it? Who can make it more dangerous? Who can keep some ships moving? And who pays the price when things go wrong? Because Hormuz is not just a place, it is a system, and systems usually do not have one master. They have several people pulling levers, some of them official, some of them armed, and some of them wearing suits while quietly moving insurance premiums high enough to ruin your quarter. Let's start with Iran, because this is the actor most people immediately think of, and for obvious reasons. Iran sits on the northern side of the strait. It has geography, military capabilities, and proximity. It has long treated Hormuz as both a strategic asset and a signalling device. That does not mean Tehran can effortlessly turn the strait on and off like a bathroom light. It does mean Iran has the ability to make passage more dangerous, more politically fraught, and more selectively negotiable through mines, drones, missile threats, harassment, seizures, and ambiguity. That distinction matters. Total permanent closure is one thing. Creating enough risk to disrupt traffic and shake markets is another. Recent Reuters reporting underlines this perfectly. Iran's own UN envoy said on March 12, 2026, that Tehran was not going to close the strait, even while the wider conflict and Iranian actions had already contributed to major disruptions, selective passage, and market turmoil. In other words, Iran does not need to say closed for the world to feel half closed, and that is where the smart, edgy part of this story begins. In modern geopolitics, the official statement and the real-world effect are often cousins, not twins. Iran can say it respects freedom of navigation under international law, and at the same time the practical conditions around the waterway can still become dangerous enough that ship owners, charterers and importers behave as if for huge, proceed at your own psychological expense sign has been hung over the route. Reuters reported that a senior UN humanitarian official even had to call for humanitarian cargo to be allowed through, while also noting that mines in the strait had severely disrupted maritime traffic. That tells you everything about the gap between legal language and operational reality. Now move south to Oman. Oman gets less dramatic attention, but it matters because the established shipping lanes run primarily through Omani territorial waters. Oman has historically played a quieter diplomatic role in Gulf tensions, and often acts more like a stabilizer than a headline machine. It is not the country most people associate with a global oil panic, but its geography is central to how the route functions legally and operationally. That is one reason the idea that Hormuz is simply Iran's strait is too crude to be useful. It is a strategic choke point bordered by more than one state, shaped by international transit norms, and watched by powers far beyond the Gulf. The Encyclopaedia Britannica and other reference works consistently note that the route lies between Iran and Oman, and that the shipping lanes are primarily in Omani waters, which matters when people oversimplify the politics. Then there is the United States and allied naval power. For decades, one of the central pillars of the Gulf security system has been the assumption that outside naval power, especially the US Fifth Fleet architecture in the region, helps deter, monitor, escort or respond when maritime threats escalate. But here is where we need nuance. Naval power can do a lot. It can escort ships, improve surveillance, deter some attacks, clear mines over time, and help reopen routes. What it cannot do is make risk disappear instantly. Reuters reported this week that Britain is working with allies on a plan to reopen the strait, while US officials have signalled that at least some ships are getting through, and that Washington is effectively okay with fuel vessels transiting, because that helps keep the world supplied. That is important. It shows that protection in Hormuz is often not a clean state of perfect security. It is a messy effort to preserve at least partial navigation under highly unstable conditions, and that leads to a point worth taking seriously. The strongest case for optimism is that Iran, even if it can badly disrupt traffic, still faces powerful military and economic constraints. A long total closure would hurt Iran too, provoke broader retaliation, and collide with the interests of major powers that depend on Gulf energy flows. That is real. Reuters reported that even amid severe disruption, some tankers have still been able to pass under negotiated or tacit arrangements, including shipments involving India and Pakistan. So the best version of the Iran cannot truly control Hormuz for long argument is not silly. It is grounded in the fact that multiple states have incentives to keep at least some traffic moving. But here is the dismantling part. Full monopoly over the strait is not required to create global leverage. Iran does not need a perfect seal. It only needs enough military reach, ambiguity, and political nerve to make the route intermittently dangerous or selectively negotiable. That is often enough to rattle buyers, spike prices, distort flows, and force diplomatic bargaining. Reuters reported that Iran allowed 2 Indian gas tankers through, and that Pakistan also secured passage for a tanker, which is revealing. It means passage can become conditional, negotiated and strategic, not simply open or closed. That is a form of influence even when it falls short of total control. Now let's talk about the Gulf Arab states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Iraq, because they are not just passive bystanders in this drama. They are heavily exposed. Their exports depend on the route to varying degrees. Their revenues depend on energy sales. Their domestic stability is linked to security. Reuters reported on March 16th that Gulf states are pressing the US to decisively reduce the Iranian threat because they do not want to live in a permanent cycle where their oil terminals, ports, and economies remain hostage to periodic escalation. But these states also have limits. Many want security without being dragged into a broader war they cannot control. That creates a classic regional paradox. They need outside protection, but fear the escalation that outside protection can trigger. And then there are the actors most people forget: ship owners, charterers, insurers, classification societies, commodity traders, and port operators. These people are not usually the stars of dramatic documentaries, because marine insurance underwriter updates war risk assessment does not exactly scream popcorn. But in practice, they are some of the most important decision makers in the system. A ship can be legally allowed to pass and still not move if the commercial terms become ugly enough. If insurance becomes prohibitively expensive, if crews refuse, if port schedules collapse, if freight rates explode, the effect can look very similar to a physical restriction. This is one reason why who controls Hormuz is the wrong question. Sometimes no one fully controls it, yet the market behaves as if someone has reached over the table and kicked the system in the shin. Then you have importing states like China, India, Japan, and South Korea. These countries are not physically on the strait, but they are powerful actors because they are the major customers. Their diplomacy matters, their naval postures may matter, their willingness to negotiate exemptions or special passage arrangements matters. Reuters reported that India has been in active diplomatic engagement over Hormuz transit because roughly 90% of its LPG imports come from the Gulf, and that more than 600 Indian crew members and numerous Indian-flagged ships were still in the region. That is a reminder that import dependence can turn faraway consumers into major geopolitical players very quickly. China is especially important here, not because it patrols the strait the way the US does, but because it is one of the biggest buyers of Gulf energy. If Hormuz is squeezed, China feels it in supply security, freight, industrial planning, and strategic positioning. This is one reason some analysts increasingly frame Hormuz not just as a Middle Eastern issue or an American naval issue, but as a global, systems issue involving Asia's industrial powers and the balance of power in energy diplomacy. In other words, a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman ends up quietly sitting in the middle of larger competition between the world's biggest economies. Very normal, very stable, excellent design. And finally, there is the International Energy Agency and the broader emergency response framework. The IEA does not command ships, but it matters because it coordinates emergency oil stock releases and signals collective response capacity. Reuters reported this week that the IEA had already supported a record reserve release, and that its executive director said more releases could follow if needed. That tells you something critical. The institutions tasked with cushioning the blow are already being used, which means Hormuz is not treated as a hypothetical classroom problem. It is treated as a live operational risk, with real macroeconomic consequences. So who controls Hormuz? Nobody. Completely. Several actors partially. And the final vote often belongs to risk itself. Iran can threaten it. Navies can defend parts of it. Oman matters geographically and diplomatically. Gulf exporters depend on it. Asian importers lobby over it. Insurers price it. Markets amplify it. And ordinary people end up paying for it. That is the uncomfortable truth. Hormuz is not a switch. It is a battlefield of incentives. Which brings us to the next part of the story, the one people usually find most dramatic. Has the strait ever actually been shut? And what does history tell us about what a future crisis might really look like? 5. History's warning label. Hormuz has rarely been totally shut, but it has repeatedly been made dangerous enough to matter. One of the most misleading things people say about the Strait of Hormuz is, well, it has never really been closed, so the danger is probably overblown. That sounds reassuring. It is also incomplete. Because the real historical lesson is not that Hormuz has always stayed perfectly open. The lesson is that it has often remained formally open while becoming operationally ugly, commercially risky, militarily tense, and economically expensive, which in practice can be plenty. Think about how traffic works in a city. A road does not need to be blocked by concrete barriers to become a disaster. One overturned truck, 2 police cordons, 3 bad decisions, and everybody is already texting, "I'm going to be late." Hormuz works the same way, except instead of commuters, we're talking about oil tankers, LNG carriers, navies, and governments, trying not to panic in public. The classic historical case is the tanker war, during the later stages of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. In 1984, the conflict expanded into attacks on oil shipping. Iraq targeted ships serving Iranian ports, and Iran retaliated by attacking tankers linked to Iraq's Gulf backers, including Kuwait and other Gulf states. Britannica notes that the tanker war included strikes on more than 100 oil tankers, and that the scale of attacks ultimately drew in the United States and several Western European countries to help secure tanker passage. That matters because it shows the pattern early. Hormuz-related crises do not need a neat official declaration of closed to become a global problem. They just need enough violence to make shipping a military question. Now put yourself there for a second. You're a tanker captain in the Gulf in 1987. You know the route technically exists. You know ships are still moving, but you also know missiles, mines, and attacks are now part of the operating environment. Open starts to feel like one of those words that is legally true and emotionally useless. That is exactly why the United States launched Operation Earnest Will in 1987, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers and escorting them through the Gulf. This was not done because everything was fine. It was done because the existing condition of technically navigable, strategically terrifying, was bad enough that major powers felt the need to intervene directly. A year later, in 1988, the US also launched Operation Praying Mantis after the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine. Again, the message is not, Hormuz can always be kept perfectly safe. The message is that keeping it usable can require heavy military commitment, and even then the risk does not politely vanish. Now jump forward to the 21st century, and the pattern becomes even clearer. There have been repeated episodes of seizures, sabotage allegations, attacks on merchant shipping and military standoffs linked to Iran, the US, and regional tensions. In 2019, for example, 6 oil tankers in or near the Strait of Hormuz were attacked over the span of about a month, according to the Council on Foreign Relations Conflict Tracker, with US officials blaming Iran. That episode did not produce a long-term complete shutdown, but it did remind everybody how quickly risk can jump from regional tension to shipping crisis. And that brings us to the most important historical distinction of all. Closure is not binary. There is the Hollywood version, where a government formally announces that no vessel shall pass and giant maps turn red. Then there is the real-world version, where ships begin rerouting. Some transponders go dark, insurers hike premiums, navies start planning escorts, importers seek exemptions, and everyone starts using phrases like de facto closure, severely restricted traffic, or safe passage arrangements. That softer language can hide very hard reality. Reuters' March 2026 reporting suggests exactly that. We now have evidence of a mostly closed strait, massive export declines, mine threats, selective negotiated passage for some ships, and emergency reserve releases being actively considered or deployed. Reuters also called the March 2026 event the biggest global oil supply disruption in history, estimating around 8 million barrels per day of lost supply, about 8% of global supply, at the peak of the shock. That is important not because it means every prior warning was identical, but because it shows how the historical logic of Hormuz risk has now collided with a worst-case modern escalation. Here is the case for the calmer historical interpretation. For decades, despite all the threats, the strait usually remained passable in some form. Even during severe crises, oil still moved, navies adapted, and the market eventually stabilized. That is true. History does show resilience. It shows that the global system does not collapse every time Hormuz becomes dangerous. But here is what that calmer reading often misses. Resilience is not the same thing as low cost. The fact that ships still moved during the tanker war did not mean the risk was trivial. The fact that naval escorts became necessary did not mean the system was healthy. The fact that markets eventually normalized did not mean the interim shock was harmless. History says Hormuz crises are often managed, but at a price: higher insurance, higher freight, higher military involvement, higher oil prices, and higher political tension. In other words, the historical record does not tell us to relax. It tells us to understand the difference between catastrophic failure and expensive dysfunction. Modern systems can survive the second while still inflicting real pain. And there is another darkly funny lesson here. The world keeps treating each Hormuz flare-up as if we have just discovered, for the first time, that concentrating huge energy flows through a narrow militarized corridor might be a bit suboptimal. Then policymakers release statements, insurers adjust numbers, navies reposition, markets wobble, and everybody acts surprised that geography has once again refused to respect optimism. So what does history really teach us? It teaches that Hormuz has often been threatened more than fully sealed. Shipping can continue under dangerous and distorted conditions. Military escorts and emergency responses can reduce damage, but not erase it. The economic harm often comes from risk, delay, and fear, not only from absolute zero flow. And when crises escalate far enough, the line between still open and effectively unusable gets very thin. That is the warning label history puts on this strait. And once you see that pattern, the next question becomes brutally practical. If Hormuz is disrupted, who gets hit first and who gets hit hardest? Because the answer is not everyone equally, not even close. 6. Who gets hit first and who gets hit hardest? Here is where the Strait of Hormuz story stops being abstract and starts getting uncomfortably specific. Because when this choke point gets disrupted, the pain is not evenly distributed. Some countries get hit first, some sectors get hit harder, some governments can cushion the blow, others basically get handed a flaming invoice and told to figure it out. UN trade and development. The first countries hit hardest are usually the ones with the biggest direct dependence on Gulf energy flows, especially in Asia. The International Energy Agency says about 80% of oil and oil products transiting the strait in 2025 were destined for Asia, and the LNG passing through Hormuz represented around 27% of Asia's total LNG imports in 2025. That is an enormous exposure. It means the strait is not just some Middle Eastern geography problem. It is embedded in the energy security of the factories, utilities and transport systems that help run the global economy. If you want a live example, look at India. Reuters reported on March 16, 2026 that India sources about 90% of its LPG imports from the Gulf, and that the current Hormuz disruption has already caused a sharp decline in LPG availability and consumption. In the first half of March, state fuel retailers sold 1.15 million metric tons of LPG, down 17.3% year-over-year and 26.3% from the prior month. India reportedly had 22 tankers stranded in the strait, and the government began prioritizing household LPG over industrial demand. That is what exposure looks like when it stops being a chart and starts becoming policy triage. And that is not just an India story. Import-dependent economies across South Asia and East Asia face similar pressure, even if their exact fuel mix differs. Japan and South Korea are highly exposed to Gulf energy flows. China is a major buyer. Pakistan depends heavily on Gulf supplies as well. Reuters reported that Pakistan had to work actively for safe transit, and that its navy and diplomats were coordinating to keep at least some shipments moving. When an importing country starts treating one tanker crossing like a diplomatic achievement, you know the supply chain is no longer operating in the normal commerce category. It has entered the please let this floating fuel bill survive the week phase. Then come the poorer and more fragile importing economies, especially in parts of Africa and the Mediterranean neighbourhood. These countries are often less visible in mainstream coverage, but in many ways they are more vulnerable because they have less fiscal room, weaker currencies, less storage, and less ability to absorb higher freight and energy costs. Reuters reported that the EBRD is weighing support for emerging economies such as Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, because the current conflict is driving higher energy costs, fertilizer shortages, weaker tourism, and broader macroeconomic stress. The bank also warned about knock-on effects through borrowing costs, remittances, and sovereign debt pressure. In other words, for weaker economies, Hormuz is not just an energy story. It can become a balance of payments story, a debt story, and eventually a political story. That same pattern shows up in humanitarian and food systems. Reuters reported that UN officials warned this month that the spread of Middle East conflict and shipping disruptions through Hormuz are putting global aid operations at risk, especially in places such as Somalia and Sudan, while also driving up food and energy costs in sub-Saharan Africa. This is one of the crueler mechanics of the whole system. The countries least responsible for the disruption, and often least able to hedge against it, can end up paying some of the highest relative costs. Global choke points have a nasty habit of invoicing the poor first. Now let's talk sectors, because countries are only half the story. The first sectors to feel the pain are usually refining, power generation, aviation, shipping, petrochemicals, and fertilizer. Reuters reported that diesel markets have been heavily disrupted by the current Middle East conflict, with analysts estimating 3 to 4 million barrels per day of diesel supply losses linked to Hormuz disruptions. Diesel matters because it sits underneath trucking, agriculture, mining, shipping, construction, and backup power. If crude is the headline fuel, diesel is the fuel that quietly runs half the boring machinery civilization depends on. When diesel spikes, everything from food transport to factory logistics starts getting uglier. Fertilizer is another underappreciated pain point. Reuters reported that more than 30% of world nitrogen fertilizer trade normally moves from Gulf producers, and that the current conflict has cut off important shipments just as farmers in multiple countries were approaching planting season. That matters because energy shocks do not stop at the gas pump. They travel into crop yields, food prices, and farm margins with a delay that can make the eventual damage look disconnected from the original cause. It is the classic supply chain horror trick. First it hits one market, then 3 weeks later it turns up somewhere else wearing a different disguise. There is also a sharp divide between countries that can cushion the shock and countries that cannot. Large advanced economies may have strategic petroleum reserves, stronger currencies, better access to finance, and more credible central banks. They still get hurt, but they often have tools. The weaker economies usually do not. If oil rises above $100 per barrel, as Reuters reported this month, and freight and fertilizer costs rise at the same time, an emerging importer with weak public finances can face a truly ugly mix. Higher subsidy bills, currency weakness, food inflation, and higher sovereign borrowing costs all at once. That is not a normal bad week. That is a macroeconomic mugging. Now, not everyone gets hit immediately or equally. Some countries have diversified import portfolios. Some can buy more from Russia, the Atlantic Basin, or elsewhere, though often at higher cost. Some industrial users can cut demand. Some governments can cap prices temporarily. Pakistan, for example, told markets its petroleum stocks remained stable, even while it worked diplomatically to keep shipments moving. Turkey appears somewhat less vulnerable because it diversified earlier, according to the EBRD discussion cited by Reuters. So yes, there are cushions. This is not a universal instant collapse button. But here's what that karma reading misses. Timing matters. The first blow usually lands on the countries with immediate import dependence and active shipments in the corridor. The deeper blow lands on the countries and sectors with the least financial resilience. The final blow lands on ordinary households when fuel, food, electricity, and transport costs start feeding into the price of daily life. So if you're asking, who gets hit hardest? The honest answer is, energy importing Asia gets hit first. Fragile developing economies often get hit most brutally relative to their capacity, and lower-income households everywhere tend to absorb the last and most politically explosive layer of pain. And that is one of the darkest ironies of Hormuz. The strait sits between Iran and Oman. The cargoes move to major buyers, the traders and navies dominate the headlines. But the final cost can show up in a village that has never seen the Gulf, a city bus fare that suddenly rises, a fertilizer invoice a farmer cannot pay, or a government budget already held together with polite optimism and debt. That is how chokepoints work. They turn local danger into global inequality. So now we know the who. The next question is the one policymakers, militaries, and energy planners obsess over. What could actually replace Hormuz, or at least reduce the world's dependence on it, and why hasn't that happened already? 7. Can the world go around Hormuz? Yes, partly. No, not cleanly. At this point, the obvious question is, why not just bypass the Strait of Hormuz, build more pipelines, use more reserves, buy from someone else, turn on more supply, problem solved, roll credits, cue upbeat music? And to be fair, that is not a stupid question. It is the right question. The problem is that the answer is annoyingly realistic. The world can reduce dependence on Hormuz at the margins, but it cannot fully and painlessly replace what the Strait does today. Not quickly, not cheaply, and not at the same scale. Let's start with the most concrete alternative. Pipelines that bypass the Gulf outlet through Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has the big one, the east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE has export infrastructure tied to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman side, specifically designed to avoid the Strait. And yes, those routes matter. Reuters reported that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been redirecting exports through these systems during the current crisis, with Saudi shipments via western ports surging, and the UAE using Fujairah plus pipeline-linked storage to keep some barrels moving. That is real resilience. It is not imaginary. But here is the catch that ruins the comforting narrative. Their combined bypass capacity still falls far short of normal Hormuz traffic. Reuters and other current reporting note that even with Saudi and UAE rerouting, the alternative routes have not come close to replacing the roughly 20 million barrels per day that normally move through the Strait. That is why, despite all the pipeline talk, Gulf exports still dropped by at least 60% during the recent disruption. The world did build side exits. It just did not build side exits big enough to carry the whole mall during a fire. And then reality added another insult. Even some of the bypass infrastructure is vulnerable. Reuters reported this week that loadings at Fujairah, the UAE's key bypass outlet, were themselves disrupted by strikes and drone attacks, while other reporting noted a fresh halt to oil loading there. This is a crucial point. A workaround is only a workaround if it keeps working. In conflict zones, even the backup plan can develop its own backup problem. The geopolitical version of "don't worry, we have a generator" gets a lot less reassuring once somebody also sets the generator on fire. What about strategic reserves? This is the next big line of defense, and it matters a lot. The International Energy Agency said on March 16, 2026, that member countries had already agreed to the largest ever coordinated oil stock release, drawing down about 20% of reserves, while still retaining roughly 1.4 billion barrels. The agency also said more releases could follow if needed. That is serious firepower, and it has already helped stabilize markets somewhat after earlier price spikes. But reserves are a bridge, not a replacement. They can smooth an acute shock, calm panic, and buy time for diplomacy, rerouting, or production adjustments. What they cannot do is permanently substitute for a sustained loss of Gulf export capacity if the disruption drags on. Reuters reported that the estimated crude deficit from the current crisis is still in the range of 5 to 8 million barrels per day, even after emergency measures. That is why the IEA keeps saying reopening Hormuz is crucial for long-term stability. You can raid the pantry during a crisis. That is not the same thing as fixing the road to the supermarket. What about buying more from elsewhere? Again, partly yes. Over time, importers can source more from the Atlantic Basin, Russia, the Americas, or other exporters, depending on sanctions, refinery configurations, freight economics, and politics. But oil markets are not Lego bricks where every barrel snaps cleanly into every refinery. Crude grades differ, shipping distances differ, contracts differ, sanctions differ, insurance differs. The world can reshuffle flows, but reshuffling is costly and messy. Even the current IEA and Reuters reporting suggests that other producers are offsetting only part of the lost Gulf output. In other words, global supply can adapt, but adaptation is not the same thing as a painless substitute. Now let's steel-man the optimistic case. The strongest argument for Hormuz risk as manageable over time goes like this. Countries are diversifying, pipelines are expanding, strategic reserves exist, demand can adjust, renewables are growing, and importers have learned from previous shocks. That is not fantasy. In fact, some of it is already happening. Japan has begun releasing reserves, Saudi Arabia has pushed more crude westward, the UAE built Fujairah precisely to lower exposure, and many countries have spent years trying to improve resilience. There is a reason the global system has not completely collapsed under every Gulf crisis. It does have buffers. But here is the dismantling part. Buffers are not replacements, and resilience is not redundancy at full scale. The current crisis proves that even with pipelines, reserves, diplomacy, and rerouting, the market still got hit hard enough to push Brent above $100, force emergency stock releases / Gulf exports, and trigger global policy responses. If the workaround system were truly sufficient, we would not be having this kind of week. The existence of cushions is real. Their insufficiency at full scale is also real. There is also a longer-term question. Why hasn't the world simply built enough infrastructure to solve this? Because the answer is expensive, political, and painfully human. Pipelines take years. Cross-border infrastructure is vulnerable to regional politics. Spare export capacity is costly to maintain. Strategic reserves are politically awkward because governments hate paying now for problems voters do not yet feel. And the energy transition, while real, has not progressed far enough to make Gulf hydrocarbons irrelevant. So the world has done what systems often do. It built some resilience, talked a lot about resilience, and still left itself structurally exposed because fully solving the problem would cost more money and coordination than most governments felt like spending before the crisis arrived. That is the dark comedy of global risk management. Everybody loves resilience after the shock. Before the shock, resilience looks suspiciously like budget pressure. There is one more angle here. Even if the world reduced oil dependence faster, Hormuz would still matter for LNG and petrochemicals. This is not just about gasoline. The current and recent reporting makes clear that disruptions in the Gulf affect gas supply, fertilizer, industrial feedstocks, and power systems too. So even a cleaner energy system does not automatically make Hormuz irrelevant overnight. It reduces some vulnerability, yes. It does not erase the choke point with a magic climate wand. So can the world go around Hormuz? Partly. Through Saudi and UAE pipelines, yes. Through strategic reserves, temporarily. Through market reshuffling somewhat. Through diversification and the energy transition, gradually. But can it replace Hormuz fully, cheaply and immediately? No. Not with current infrastructure. Not with current demand. Not with current geopolitics. And definitely not while the backup ports are also under threat. That is why this strait keeps haunting the global economy. Everyone knows the workaround list. Nobody has built one big enough to make the original problem disappear. And this is probably the perfect place for a quick reminder. If you're enjoying the breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the next choke point or economic pressure point you want me to unpack. Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, the Taiwan Strait, rare earths, semiconductor bottlenecks, whatever global weak spot is currently pretending not to be a weak spot. Because the final question in this story is the biggest one of all. What does Hormuz reveal about how the global economy is actually built, and what warning should we take from that? 8. The bigger lesson. Hormuz is not just a strait. It is a warning about how the world really works. So after all of this, what is the real lesson of the Strait of Hormuz? It is not just that one narrow waterway matters a lot. It is that the global economy is far more fragile, concentrated and psychologically reactive than people like to admit. Hormuz reveals something uncomfortable about modern civilization. We built an unbelievably complex system of trade, finance, manufacturing, electricity, food production, and political stability on top of a few critical bottlenecks, and then acted surprised every time one of them started smoking. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the clearest examples because the numbers are so outrageous. The US Energy Information Administration says roughly 20 million barrels per day move through it in 2024, representing around 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, plus about 1/5 of global LNG trade. That is not a minor dependency. That is the global economy putting a shocking amount of faith in a narrow corridor between Iran and Oman and hoping geopolitics behaves itself. History suggests hope is not a serious risk management framework. And here is the first warning Hormuz gives us. Efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. For decades, the global economy optimized for cheap supply, reliable flows and low-cost energy. That made sense. It helped fuel growth. It lowered costs. It supported trade and industrial expansion. But efficiency has a dark side. It often concentrates risk. The same system that gives you cheap energy in normal times can become brutally exposed in crisis times. The world did build buffers, pipelines, reserves, naval patrols, insurance markets, diversified sourcing, but not enough to fully remove the choke point. So what we have is a system that works very well most days, and then suddenly reminds everyone that most days is not a resilience plan. The second warning is even more important. Markets price fear before physical reality fully arrives. This is one reason Hormuz matters so much. You do not need a total and permanent closure to cause real economic damage. You only need enough risk to make markets nervous, insurers expensive, cargoes uncertain, and governments defensive. That is exactly what recent events have shown. Reuters reported that Gulf oil exports fell by at least 60% during the current disruption, while the IEA moved into emergency response mode with record stock releases and said more could follow if necessary. That is not the market overreacting to a rumour. That is the system telling you this choke point is still very real. The third lesson is moral as much as economic. The people hit hardest are often not the people causing the crisis. We talked about India's LPG strain, fragile emerging markets facing food and energy pressure, and humanitarian systems in Africa getting squeezed by a conflict centred far away. That pattern matters. Choke points are not equal opportunity pain machines. They tend to punish the countries with less fiscal space, weaker currencies, greater import dependence, and poorer households who spend a larger share of income on transport, electricity, and food. UNCTAD and Reuters have both emphasised that developing economies are particularly exposed to maritime disruption through higher freight, energy, and commodity costs. So yes, Hormuz is a strategic story, but it is also a story about how global shocks translate into inequality. The strongest case for calm is that the world is not helpless. Strategic reserves exist. Bypass routes exist. Naval coalitions exist. Some demand can adjust. More renewable power and electrification over time may reduce the share of economic life directly tied to oil. And history does show that even severe Hormuz crises have often been managed rather than allowed to become permanent breakdowns. Those are all real reasons not to descend into theatrical doom posting, but here is the dismantling part. Manageable does not mean cheap, safe, or politically harmless. The fact that the world can limp through a choke point crisis does not mean the structure is sound. It means the system has just enough shock absorbers to survive being badly designed. That is different. It is the economic equivalent of a car that keeps making it home, despite a dashboard full of warning lights. You can call that resilience if you want. A mechanic might call it denial with momentum, and that leads to the biggest lesson of all. Hormuz matters because it shows that the world economy is not only built on production and consumption, it is built on routes, on passages, on connectors, on narrow places where too much value is forced through too little room. The Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, major semiconductor hubs, undersea cables, rare earth processing chains, these are not side details. These are the joints in the skeleton, and when one joint gets stressed, the whole body starts walking funny. So if you are watching this as an investor, policymaker, student, business owner, or just a person trying to understand why global news keeps showing up in your wallet, here are the core takeaways. First, the Strait of Hormuz still matters because the volumes are enormous and the alternatives are partial. Second, the danger is not just a dramatic full closure, it is also delay, risk, insurance costs, selective passage, and panic pricing. Third, the first hits land on energy importing Asia, but the harshest relative pain often lands on more fragile economies and lower-income households. Fourth, the world has buffers, but not enough to fully replace Hormuz at scale in the short run. Fifth, if you want to understand the modern economy, stop thinking only in terms of countries and start thinking in terms of choke points. Geography is still running a lot of the show, it just wears a more sophisticated suit now, and that is why the Strait of Hormuz matters to the world. Not because it is mysterious, not because it is overhyped, but because it is one of those rare places where geography, energy, finance, war risk, inflation, and trade all collide in full view. It is a narrow passage with global consequences, a small place carrying very large consequences, a reminder that for all our technology and financial engineering, civilization is still only a few vulnerable routes away from an expensive panic. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe and check out the rest of the playlist on global choke points, energy shocks, and economic pressure points. I'm going to be making follow-up videos on the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Taiwan Strait, because once you start seeing how the world is built around bottlenecks, you cannot unsee it. And let me know in the comments, which global choke point should we explain next? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.